a series of conventions with Marcus Garvey, a series of congresses with W.B. Du Bois, Maurice and Jamu and our sister Angela. We talked about how, starting from that moment, in Ghana, in other parts of Africa, people were organizing every year the All African People's Conferences, the series. And then we think that starting from now on, reclaiming the spirit of that conference, we need to make an assessment of the struggle. So that's why we're here, and I thank you again. And I'm going to, today, we decided that the conference was going to be about Panafricanism and Decolonization today, lessons from the 1958 All African People's Conference.
Greetings everyone. I'm honored to be a part of this conference, and it's exciting to be with you today as we commemorate and draw lessons from the 1958 All African People's Conference. I want to thank the event organizer, Nyaka, who's just stepped out, as well as Netfa Freeman and my fellow panelists, Maurice Carney and Ajamu Baraka, the Festival Center, the setup and cleanup crews, and everyone else who's contributed to making this wonderful event. Since my topic is decolonization and Pan-African solidarity, the broadest of the three themes, I have two goals. The first is to sketch the historical events that motivated Pan-Africanists and how Pan-Africanism was created and how it evolved. The second is to provide social theory to help us think through why creating and maintaining Pan-African solidarity is challenging, despite its clear benefits, and how we might move forward in ways responsive to these challenges. I hope my remarks will inform our Q&A session, particularly as we consider how we want to envision and carry out a Pan-Africanist agenda. Africa for Africans. These words encapsulate a 600-year-old struggle to control the political, economic, and other social systems that determine the well-being of Africans in the continent itself. Pan-Africanism, with pan meaning all or whole, expands what constitutes the African beyond the continent and the people who occupy it. Pan-Africanism encompasses at least three dimensions. One, geographic, Africa as a continent. Two, identity. Africans, while coming from various ethnic and cultural backgrounds, with some living on the continent and some abroad, are one people because they share historical experiences. And three, political, a solidarity or a willingness to struggle alongside one another to gain control or at least significant influence over the political, economic, and other social systems that govern African and African descendants' lives. Well, these three aspects of Pan-Africanism have been present since the inception since Pan-Africanism's inception, in the 1800s, the individuals and groups who use Pan-Africanism to interpret the world and their place within it have continuously redefined what the concept means to respond to the opportunities and the constraints that they faced. But let us take a step back for a moment to recall the history that precedes Pan-Africanism. Africa has been home to many societies and ethnic groups in the last several millennia, many of which created the basis for what we call civilization, or complex human societies characterized by strong religious, philosophical, and cultural beliefs and practices, the division of labor, and the use of advanced technology. Africa is the place where Homo sapiens evolved 200,000 years ago, for that matter. Senegalese scholar and politician Cheikh Anta Diop, in his book Civilization or Barbarism, An Authentic Anthropology, and U.S. sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois, in his book The World in Africa, Color and Democracy, offer compelling evidence that the supposed paragons of ancient Western thought, the Greeks, sought instruction from the ancient Egyptians, which include the highly melanated peoples of the Upper Nile, such as the Nubians, that is people today we consider black. They also note, for instance, the achievements of the kingdoms of Mali, Ghana, and Songhai in the 15th and 16th centuries, which supported tens of thousands of people at a high standard of living for that time, and which produced and exchanged goods highly sought after throughout Western and Northern Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Scholarly, technological, and cultural and religious achievement across the continent, not just in Egypt, and their once peer-to-peer relationship with European societies are speaking to audiences that believe Africa had no significant history prior to its contact with Europeans. And certainly no history that contributed to the Europeans' relationships with Europeans shifted from mutual respect to one where Europeans sought to dominate African peoples and resources. The two historical processes that made it a necessity for for Africans on the continent and in the diaspora to have to assert a self-conception and worldview distinct from Europeans were, first, Europeans' forcible removal of 13 million Africans from the continent through the transatlantic slave trade from the 15th through 19th centuries, and two, colonization. European colonization of Africa began formally in 1885 with the Berlin Conference, but Europeans had been extracting resources and forcing Africans to labor for them long before 1885. What changed the nature of the European-African relationship from that of trade and mutual respect to one characterized by Europeans seeking to dominate Africans? Well, Europe in the 1400s was a time of great turmoil and an inflection point in its history, with far-reaching consequences for African history. In Europe, there was a shift from feudalism to mercantile capitalism. Many of Europe's burgeoning nation-states, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, France, and Great Britain, competed with one another for supremacy and fought wars with each other, leading to a desire for even more wealth. And there were a series of religious upheavals, such as the Spanish Inquisition. An outgrowth of the political, economic, and other social unrest in Europe was the so-called Age of Exploration, a sort of release valve for the social pressures just discussed. These so-called explorers, mind you, people have always been curious. The issue is not exploration. It's the nature of the relationships one seeks to establish with other peoples in the land they occupy when one does such exploring. But I digress. These explorers sought to create wealth for themselves and the kings and queens who sponsored their trips. While gold and other precious metals were present in the Americas over time, was the production of cash crops, sugarcane, cotton, tobacco, rice, that became the means for creating wealth for Europeans. Cultivating crops requires intense labor. Europeans experimented with many different labor arrangements, including indentured servitude for Europeans, but the enslavement of Africans is the arrangement Europeans settled on. At the dawn of the transatlantic slave trade, there were internal movements of enslaved people among indigenous African societies, usually in the aftermath of wars. However, Europeans took the majority of enslaved Africans by force. Most importantly, the scale and the means of executing and maintaining the slave system in the Americas and in the Caribbean is unique in all of human history for several reasons, because Europeans used Africans' unpaid labor as their primary source of wealth. They tortured Africans to force them to attain high production yields. They instituted a system of perpetual intergenerational transmission of slavery from parents to their children, and devised human ranking schemes and pseudoscience to normalize and rationalize Africans' enslavement and their social death, to borrow a term from US sociologist Orlando Patterson. Racism is an outgrowth of slavery. It reflects the need to justify the unjustifiable. Racism entails ranking people groups based on visible characteristics or phenotype, skin color, hair texture, etc., and ascribing meaning to each group of people based on those characteristics. In the case of white supremacy, white people, people of European origin, deemed themselves superior to black people, people of African origin. Africans were construed as bestial, not worthy of full human regard. It is in this context, in the late 1800s, where enslavement, racism, colonialism, and imperialism were the modal experience of African and African-descended peoples, that Pan-Africanism developed among Africans in the diaspora. Though it is important to note that maroon societies, armed resistances, and other forms of contestation were common among enslaved Africans. Perhaps most notably, under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture, enslaved Africans in Haiti revolted against the French colonizers, becoming in 1803 the first black nation state in the Americas. Trinidadian scholar C.L.R. James writes about the Haitian people's role in the French Revolution and ultimately how they secured victory over Napoleon's forces and thus independence from France in his book Black Jacobins, Toussaint Louverture and the San Domingo Revolution. The first political mobilization of Pan-Africanism occurred in London in 1906 under the leadership of Trinidadian lawyer Henry Sylvester Williams, who fought against British colonialism in Trinidad. Another instrumental figure in the development of Pan-Africanism is W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois led 4 of the 5 Pan-African Congresses held before the first wave of African countries were independent of their European colonizers. At the Fifth Pan-African Congress in 1945, the year World War II ended, critical steps were taken to coordinate the efforts of anti-colonial activists. Another significant Pan-Africanist figure in the 1800s and early 1900s is Marcus Garvey, and he's from Jamaica, though most of his Pan-Africanist initiatives are based in the United States. That is until the US government deported him. Garvey founded the fraternal organization, the United Negro Improvement Association, or UNIA, in 1914. UNIA auxiliary components included the Black Star Steamship Line and the international newspaper Negro World. Among the women who organized and facilitated early Pan-Africanism in Africa was built upon. In the post-war period, Pan-Africanism shifted from being racialistic to state-centric, or focused on Africans gaining control of the political regimes that governed them. Across the Atlantic, while Pan-Africanism was taking hold among African diaspora communities, though the transatlantic slave trade had ended in the mid-1800s, Europeans remained in Africa and devised new processes for extracting raw materials and for forcing Africans to labor for them. In the early 1900s, industrialists in Europe and the United States were not only interested in African metals and minerals, gold, copper, diamonds, they were also interested in palm oil and rubber. For instance, the Belgians, in their hunger for rubber, are estimated to have killed 10 million Africans and cut off Africans' hands as punishment for failure to meet Belgians' demands. During World War II, Africans' labor and material resources were an integral part of the war effort, with thousands of Africans fighting in the war. After the war, African descendant peoples hoped the Allies' victory would be a double V, right? Victory over the Axis powers and victory against racist policies and colonization the world over. Reasonable thing to hope for. However, the Allied powers' commitment to liberating Europe from the tyranny of Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese Empire did not transfer to the colonies the Allied powers controlled and benefited from. Not only were the Allies intent to have virtually unrestricted access to Africa's raw materials, which were vital to their industrial economies, they also viewed control of Africa through the geostrategic lens of the Cold War. The United States and its partners, namely the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, fought against the Soviet Union through proxy wars in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, though of course it's the African experience that we highlight today. As each colonized area sought independence after World War II, there were at least 6 groups who had a vested interest in the outcome of a given country, including the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, and 6 multinational corporations. As a result, post-World War II decolonization was protracted, the result of years of African strategic maneuvering and violent struggle. It was not until 37 years after the end of World War II that all African countries were independent, bookended by Ghana in 1957 and South Africa in 1994. At the 7th Pan-African Congress held in 1994 in Kampala, Uganda, women's liberation was a prominent theme. Women at the conference founded Pan-African Women's Liberation Organization to create space for articulating an agenda that would increase women's capacity for self-determination. Another concern raised at the 1994 conference was the need to have a conception of Pan-Africanism from below, a term Democratic Republic of the Congo Senator Ernest Wamba Diawamba introduced. Pan-Africanism of this sort, according to Wamba, recognizes that there has been defeat through victory, that while African leaders may have political authority, that authority is devastatingly compromised by the structuring of African economies in ways that continue to support Western imperialism. A focus on fostering greater cooperation among professionals within Africa, beyond what is demonstrated through the African Cup of Nations, groups support the social order, obviating the state's needs for coercive action, that is force, to maintain the social order. Therefore, even the most righteous resistance contends with many mutually reinforced social arrangements that people are invested in, albeit to varying degrees. While the European progenitors of Marxism in the mid-1800s, Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, predict that oppressed workers, the proletariat, who suffer the physical and psychological hardships that create the surplus value or profit, that the capitalists or the bourgeoisie, the surplus value or profit for the capitalists or bourgeoisie will eventually revolt. European sociologist Max Weber, writing later in the 1800s and early 1900s, offers a more complex theory of society, According to Weber, we have multiple statuses that shape how we see the world, what we value, and the styles of life we pursue, and ultimately, with whom we will feel solidarity. While it is the case that stable society's use of violence is often not overt, but implicit, or at least hidden from plain view, it is imperative not to minimize the primacy that brutal violence plays in the background in social theory I just discussed, as well as the role that brutal violence, played in the original accumulations I mentioned earlier, wealth building through slavery and colonialism. Frantz Fanon, a Martinican psychiatrist, philosopher, and fighter in Algeria's war of independence against France, wrote in his book, The Wretched of the Earth, "The last shall be first." Decolonization is verification of this. This determination to have the last move up to the front, to have them clamber up too quickly, some say, the famous echelons of an organized society, can only succeed by resorting to every means, including, of course, violence. And Martinican scholar Aimé Césaire argues in his book Discourse on Colonialism that the forces that led to human cataclysms like the 20th century wars haunt us today. That Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich and similarly oriented totalitarian regimes are a logical downstream of unmitigated desire to achieve a superhuman race based on one definition of human achievement, and where there is no regard for the cost incurred by people deemed inferior. As we look forward to consider how we can make Africa for Africans and how Pan-Africanism can serve as a means to achieve this, we must take heart of the fact that Pan-Africanism must be grounded in people's daily lived experience. To do this, Pan-Africanists must work in concert with other civil society groups, from neighborhood associations to church groups to book clubs. In working with other civil society groups, we as Pan-Africanists must be attuned to the tension of accounting for African and African descendants' heterogeneous experiences and histories alongside a shared focus on political and economic solutions that uplift African and African descendant people as a whole. Threading this needle requires being in community with each other, even when it's uncomfortable, perhaps especially then. We need to create a principle-based, yet adaptive Pan-African common sense, narratives, repertoires, and frames regarding what it means to be Pan-African, as well as tangible ways to realize our vision. In the question and answer period, perhaps we might think about what it would take to build the sorts of resilient communities that can foster political solidarity among African people and people of African descent. We might also consider, how do we reach agreement on policy platforms, prioritize policy goals, and petition government and other institutions to respond? How can we spend our money in ways that reinforce our policy priorities? What social activities might we abstain from to indicate our desire for social change? These are just a few of the questions I thought of to get us started. I look forward to hearing your comments during the question and answer period. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Angela. Since we had the privilege, to discover her at on Saturday, October 14th, when we were doing our Thomas Sankara's conference, and then she was in the audience, and she exactly asked a question that was related to the conversation that we are having, and then we said she is going to be the perfect person, to address that issue, and she's doing a wonderful job. She did that at Lincoln University. She did that again today. So again, let's give another round of applause to Angela Sims.